Greetings all, this is Hairy Nick. How you guys going? X-Wing 2nd edition is here now, so let's have a chat about the meta, or at least what will become the meta, because we don't have a meta right now. Indeed, ever since I started playing X-Wing, this point in time right now is probably the point where the meta, as it were, is in the most flux possible. Everything has had a power reset. Well, almost everything's had a power reset. There are a lot of new elements in the game, a lot of new rules changes. So people are basically just trying everything else, seeing what sticks, and it means that we're basically going to have to wait at least a month or two before we have some kind of an established meta. And even at that point, there will be things people haven't tried out in tournaments, and the meta will still evolve even without extra game elements before the Resistance and First Order entered into the game. So this video is just my top 10 predictions in terms of archetype lists that are going to be in the meta. Now, before I start these, yes, this is very much just my opinion. I will say, I think overall, I'm about 50-50 when it comes to predictions. I consider myself much better when it comes to sort of analysing what we know about the meta rather than trying to predict what goes into it. For example, I never would have predicted the Sheathopede would have been as powerful as it was, for example. So yes, take everything I say here in this video with a grain of salt. But I think based on what I've seen submitted from you guys, based on everything revealed, the power level of cards, what has survived from 1st to 2nd edition in terms of the power level shift, I think we have a pretty good idea about at least a few of these things. And I'm pretty confident at least a few of the things I'm talking about in this video will have some meta play and will be successful. I'm going to run through this list in no particular order. Let's start out with asymmetrical rebel builds. I'm going to call this Fat YTs. Looking particularly at the rebel faction, I was talking the other day about turrets. And the sort of spikiness people are looking at of using things like Veteran Turret Gunner, Veteran Tail Gunner. I don't think that these cards in particular are going to be what is going to push turrets or rear-firing arcs. I think the key thing when we look at turrets is going to be action efficiency. And that's why I particularly look at the YTs, and particularly at Dash Rendar and Lando Calrissian. Both of these pilots have the utility to kind of work through the issues of having a turret. In the case of Dash, you can ignore rocks as you're flying, so you can barrel roll and move your turrets even if you hit a rock. And Lando can move his turret arc every time he does a green maneuver. Both of those things are super powerful, and I think based on that, these two cards are probably going to be two of the best turret users in the game. And I think alongside these guys in the Rebel faction, particularly looking at the more expensive, smaller ships like Luke Skywalker or Corran Horn, there is a list here based on some combination of these cards. I already spoke about Lando Calrissian and Luke Skywalker in one of the lists I reviewed just recently, and I'm sure as I review more lists there will be more of these coming up because it's going to be something people experiment with now. I think the power level is going to be good, and just based on what's happened with these in 2nd edition, it's going to get a lot of people excited in terms of experimentation. Just before I continue on, I will point out that those are the two factors I think that are really going to drive these lists. It's going to be what is just powerful and what inspires people to list build. Those are the two factors that are going to establish the early meta with X-Wing 2nd edition. And I think those big fat YTs on the Rebel faction alongside a powerful small ship, my guess right now is going to be Luke Lando, but it could be Dash Corran, it could be Corran Lando, it could even be Han Corran or something like that. But I think that's an archetype we have to keep a close eye on. The next thing I want to talk about is bombing, because bombing was a very powerful thing in 1st edition, and I think based on what little I've played of 2nd edition so far, bombing is still a very powerful tactic, but it is not as oppressive anymore. You'd no longer have an Initiative 7 or PS10 Captain Nim that can react perfectly to your opponent's ships, but we do have a bit more reach when it comes to bombing and a bit more flexibility in the way Seismic Charge runs. And I've talked about this before, Seismic Charge alongside Proton Bomb seems to be a very, very potent ability. And I think particularly on the Scum faction, this is going to work quite well. The Scum faction overall generally has the most versatile ships out of the 3 current factions in X-Wing. And I look at pilots particularly like Eamon Azameen, Captain Nim, maybe Sol Sigza, maybe even a fire spray platform like Boba Fett with bombing could be effective. I'm particularly looking, however, at this moment at Eamon Azamine and Captain Nim. I think there is a list there. Proton bombs and seismics on both of those platforms has a lot of flexibility. And I really like particularly what the Fire Spray is doing in second edition. Even the Scum Bomber, people are really writing this off. And I think people are being a bit harsh because you got to remember the Scum Bomber isn't really that much less powerful if you don't want missiles and torpedoes on it, because it doesn't have missiles and torpedoes in second edition, but it is a lot more cheaper as a result. Captain Nim, for example, is only 52 points. Relatively speaking, from first edition, he used to be 60 points. That's a reduction of 8 points. And if you go for a dedicated bomb build on him, he has a lot of utility holding those bombs in place, especially if you fly him alongside Eamon Azamine, where not only you have a lot of options as to where you place your bombs, but you can choose what bomb you place down, either one that latches onto a rock that doesn't, and then you can hold them in situ with Captain Nim. And I think this is the kind of list that's going to take a lot more practice, so we might not see it in the very early days of the second edition meta, but it's something to watch out for if bombing is going to continue. And I think given its versatility, it's a lot fairer now, but I think given its versatility moving forward, if bombing is going to be a thing, this is the one to look out for. All right, let's talk about the Empire faction. And I think something that was very successful in first edition is going to continue in second edition, and that is the archetypical commander builds. In first edition, it was just Palp, but in second edition, I'm looking at two particular commanders. Palp continues, in my eyes, to be a very potent thing. I actually had the chance last week to play against one. I think he is absolutely fantastic still. I think people are severely underrating Palp. The flexibility of using his ability after he rolls dice is fantastic, even though it's only focus results. I think the shift in damage and defense is a lot fairer overall for all different archetypes, and Palp feels like he is in keeping with that, but still gives you a lot of flexibility and reach. But also I want to talk about Grand Moff Tarkin, because I think out of all the other commanders that the Empire has, Grand Moff Tarkin, it has the most explosive potential. I think the clincher with Grand Moff Tarkin is going to be, can we consistently push across a lot of target locks with him? And I think alongside a TIE Fighter swarm, we can achieve that, especially when it comes to a lot of the named TIE Fighters that work well together. I think this is going to be something that is going to be very powerful. And again, like bombing, it's going to take a lot of practice because it's going to need the perfect setup and the perfect payoff every single time, consistently game to game. I think Palp is going to be the more explosive, consistent option in the very, very early meta because people have already had a lot of practice with him in first edition. I think the Palp Sunterfell Vader list that I've seen floating around a little bit is already very playable and pushed. But Tarkin is another one. In terms of Imperial Commanders, I think these are the two to look out for. And continuing on that conversation about Tarkin, indeed from this point on we're going to talk about a few different ships that I think are going to be very potent en masse. And oddly enough, these are the original ships from the Battle of Yavin. Talking about Tarkin, TIE swarms. Basically, FFG, Alex Davies in particular, has talked about this, talking about how the TIE Fighter has basically become the base level sort of benchmark ship in the game. Everything seems to be balanced in terms of how it reacts and how much better or worse it is than a TIE Fighter. A TIE Fighter is a very bare bones ship, has a very basic stat line, action bar and dial, but it's also very cheap to reflect that. There are some ships that are a tad cheaper than the cheapest TIE Fighter, but nonetheless, nothing is going to fly, well, in my opinion, nothing is going to fly in a swarm better than a TIE Fighter. Its named pilots really lean into that strategy. All of the Inferno Squadron pilots, Howlrunner, even Wampa, it seemed to be like FFG is really going to push that archetype. And in direct contrast to the TIE Fighter, I also want to bring up the X-Wing. Because the X-Wing is another ship that FFG have talked about. Hey, we really want to make sure that this has a place in the meta. Now, unlike the TIE Fighter, it's not really the standard baseline ship. It has a lot more flexibility in the way it flies. It has the flip configuration, which really means it's not really a standard base level ship. But nevertheless, the X-Wing is a very interesting ship in my eyes because it really seems to straddle the line between Ace and Brawler. Its combat effectiveness really means it can push across a lot of damage, but with only 2 agility, I don't think it really strictly becomes a strict definition of what we would call an Ace. but with all those barrel rolls and boosts, that kind of stuff, it can sort of do a pseudo-ace impression. And against ships with low initiative, that's going to be very, very potent. And I think with that flexibility, I don't really think there's another ship that can kind of straddle the line in terms of what its role is going to be. And en masse, as a 4 of, potentially even a 5 of, the X-Wing is going to be very, very interesting. And more to the point, it's going to be very adaptive to a lot of different situations. I think there are plenty of other ships that you're going to want to fly en masse because you like to lean into a certain strategy, but I think the X-Wing is going to be the most versatile. And in terms of other ships that I think are going to be powerful en masse, probably less versatile, I want to talk about the Y-Wing flown en masse. Because I think this ship just has a lot to offer in terms of basically saying to your opponent, I have this much health on the side of the table, can you shoot through it? It also has excellent crowd control techniques in ion cannon turret. You can double tap if you take veteran turret gunners, that kind of stuff. The base level cost of 32 points on both the Scum and Rebel faction seems very competitive. And I think if we're going to run those base level pilots, it basically leans into whether or not we want illicits. Because if you want illicits, you take the Scum variant. If you don't want illicits, you take the Rebel variants because they cost the same amount of points, but the Rebel ship has one more initiative. And we saw this a bit in first edition with Thug Life, the TLT, Unhinged Astromech, Syndicate Thugs on the Scum faction. We're not going to see something quite like that in second edition. However, the points have reduced a little bit. We still have R4 Astromech to reduce the difficulty of the 1 and 2 speed maneuvers. So you still get blue hard turns, you still get turrets, you can potentially double tap with those turrets, and everything's a bit cheaper, a little bit more efficient. Sure, you're not shooting in 360 degrees, but having said that, in first edition with the BTLA 4 title, there were instances where the Y-Wing didn't want to shoot 360 degrees and was still relatively effective. And I think that's going to continue into second edition. It doesn't seem to have been hit too hard by the power level reduction overall. So with ships being a little bit defensive across the board, I think the Y-Wing swarm is going to perform a little bit better. And talking a bit more about ships en masse, and this isn't going to be talking about a ship in specific, but I think with the power level increase on the TIE Bombers and the Alpha Class Starwings, who now has access to free configurations, I think we need to seriously look at Alpha Strikes on the Empire faction. I don't think any other faction really has this in spades. I mean, we could arguably look at the Alpha Strike on the Scum faction with the contracted scouts getting their torpedo backs, but I think a lot of the tools that made that great in first edition just aren't there right now, and I'm really looking at the Empire faction now. People are really raving about the TIE Bomber at this stage. It now has 2 bombs, 2 missiles, and a torpedo. It is very competitively costed. You can basically give it bombs, missiles, and or torpedoes and still get 5 of them on the table. Now, in first edition, there were sort of relatively competitive-ish, depending on your meta, sort of 4 of builds with Deadeye and cruise missiles and that kind of stuff. And that was a lot of fun, but that really depended on the meta. If you needed to shoot through a lot of hull, like triple Skirgs or like Scum lists, that was okay. I didn't mind that list. But the reality now with the bombers is you can get nice versatile bombing and ordnance on the same platform for a pretty competitive cost. And that means you can pretty much react to all these different kinds of scenarios. If you're up against swarms, your cluster missiles, your seismics, protons are going to be good. Against aces, you could field homing missiles en masse. Now, I've already spoken before about homing missiles. I'm not a huge fan of this card, but I think if you have 4 of them, it becomes a lot better because at that point you can really pressure your opponent's ships. I really like the look of barrage rockets. I think that gives the bombers a very nice push as well. Yeah, I think the TIE Bomber in particular has had a very nice push. The Alpha Class Starwing, being able to shoot at things it has locked even when it has a weapons disable token, was good in first edition. It's going to continue to be good in second edition. Oh, and if that wasn't good enough, now you have the access to that ability without having to spend any points. So yeah, I think between these 2 platforms that Empire Alpha Strikes is going to be pretty legit. Actually, let's just talk about one more Empire archetype because I want to talk about more dedicated ace builds. I think now, more than ever, the Empire is absolutely where it's at in terms of aces. It'll be interesting when the Republic comes out and we get some Jedis in their Jedi Starfighters, but for the time being, it's absolutely Empire to the core. Now, we spoke before about PALP-based lists. I will say there is a case to be made for more dedicated ace lists without PALP, particularly because of the TIE Defender. Now, the TIE Defender has had a large points increase as well as a large power increase. This is largely because Push the Limits is no longer in the X-Wing format, and as a result, FFG were able to give some ships, the TIE Defender included, a massive action bar. Also a really excellent baked-in ability, being able to get those evade tokens. This platform looks fantastic. And this is really the design FFG wanted for the TIE Defender in the first place. They wanted something that could be a little bit more than 1/3 of your list, but still function accordingly. And it never really worked out in first edition. They had to fix it in such a way that made it cheaper and more effective. As a result, people were flying 3 of, and that's kind of where the TIE Defender ended up. In second edition, it's going to be 2 TIE Defenders, maybe alongside a more affordable ace like a generic Inquisitor or something like that, maybe alongside a few TIEs. But we're looking at TIE Defenders as a bit of a point sink, and for that reason, I don't think they're going to fare that well with Palpatine. And it's really going to ask people to do a bit more of some dedicated Imperial Ace builds. Indeed, talking about Inquisitor, the Inquisitor and the generic Inquisitors as well really do push this archetype. Generic Inquisitors being a bit lower initiative, so perhaps they won't be as flexible or they won't be as adaptive as some aces. But with supernatural reflexes floating around, maybe they will. Maybe we'll have like a quasi 4 ace-ish build, if that makes any sense. I don't really know if we can call them aces at an initiative 3, but it's a discussion worth having nonetheless. Nevertheless, yeah, look, Defenders, Inquisitor, Suntafel, Vader, there are a lot of options for just dedicated straight down the line ace builds on the Empire. And I think, again, this is going to be pretty legit. I don't think we need PALP to make these guys work. Now, at the start of the video, we talked about asymmetric builds on the Rebel faction, but I do want to talk about 2-ship builds, specifically symmetrical builds on the Scum faction, because I think this is also something to look out for. A lot of the early experimentation seems to be around the 2-ship builds. I am no exception to that. I am a Scum player. I'm also playing around with these. I think some variation of Boba Lando, Boba Eamon Asmin, Boba Han. A lot of lists with Boba, but Boba's had a very nice push in terms of power level. The 2 of Bounty Hunter list is seriously going to have a look at. I don't know whether that's going to be IGs moving forward. I don't think IGs are quite as in a good a place as they were in first edition. But given that the power level of everything's come down a little bit, it seems okay. I just think the problem with IGs now is they don't really seem to have any kind of bomb talent or bomb cannon. And in first edition, we were looking at like a crack shot, push the limit, mangler cannons, heavy laser cannons, all that kind of stuff. Those tools kind of still exist, but they've all been tempered down in terms of power level. So I don't think it's IGs right now. I'm looking particular at things that include Boba Fett. I think he's had a nice push in power level. I think he's a fantastic option for the Scum faction right now. Maybe alongside Lando Calrissian on the YT 1300. I think it's going to be some form of list that has Boba and something else. These 2 of Bounty Hunter lists, and what these lists can really show off in the Scum faction is the versatility of the faction. A lot of great utility slots on these ships, on the YT and on the Fire Spray. We got things like crew, illicit, different kinds of ordnance and bombs and all that kind of stuff. And it's going to be a case of trying to capitalize off these pilot abilities and give ourselves options to adapt to a lot of different situations. I think the addition of L337 alone is fantastic for the Scum faction. I spoke about running this in my first ever list, and the ability to blank out one of your opponent's attacks and then give your ship a better dial is very significant. It's these kinds of utility options that I think is going to really drive the Scum faction forward. I think it's what FFG are really leaning into with the faction in terms of designing. And I think it's really going to show in the kind of lists that are flown on the faction. And the final archetype I want to talk about is Jank-vard Rebels, because I've had a look at a lot of different Rebel lists that you guys have submitted, and I think there really is something there. And when I say Jank-vard Rebels, I don't mean like swarms of any particular ship. I mean 4 of builds that use different pilots. Because we have a lot of ships on the Rebel faction that are going to be part of the Scum faction, that are going to be part of the Republic, even one that's going to be part of the CIS. But I think the telling factor of what makes these ships Rebel is their pilot abilities. The ability to work together, to handshake, to have those group hug style builds is going to be tantamount. I'm looking particularly at ships like Nora Wexley that gets a benefit when you're close to other ships. Jake Farrell giving your ships a bit more action economy. Wedge Antilles being that great finisher. We got various platforms that want your ships to be in close range. Various platforms that want your ships to be in close range of your opponent. I just think there's going to be just some dumb combination with Jank-vard Rebels. We don't have Lorik and Biggs firing on all cylinders like we did in first edition. I don't think that matters. I think we're going to have in the meta some kind of Jank-vard Rebel list that does rise to the top, that is more in line with the kind of archetype that FFG wants for the Rebel faction. They don't want just pure damage denial. They don't want feel bad situations for your opponent. They want more interactivity on your side of the board. And that is going to be a very telling thing. And yes, that's my top 10 predictions. Now, I apologize straight off if I was a bit vague with these predictions. I don't want to say absolutely any particular pilot or upgrade will perform especially well, because we need to have a better understanding of the kind of things that do perform well before we know which other pilots will perform well, because certain pilots are good against other pilots and that kind of stuff. So I just want to keep things vague and open for the time being. In the comments section below, if you think that any of the lists that I've suggested won't perform well for any particular reason, let me know and say why. And if you think I missed anything, also let me know in the comments. And again, give your reason as to why you think it will perform well. Again, I just want to remind you guys that I am leaning more towards meta play with this list. There are a ton of awesome casual builds that you guys are submitting, and I don't want to discourage you guys from flying those kinds of things, because you have to remember, every meta list at one point or another had to be invented, and a lot of things that have risen to the top of the meta were at one stage casual builds, so I'm not discrediting those one little bit. In the meantime, guys, thank you so much for watching. We have a lot more list reviews to do, a lot more lists to talk about in second edition, a lot more archetypes. It's going to be a lot of fun. In the meantime, like and subscribe, like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter and Reddit, and I'll catch you guys later on.